All right. Welcome back, everybody. It's been a while since my last video recording, and with this this discussion, I am joined by my brilliant colleague, Dr. Kavi Abraham. And Kavi and I teach international relations theory together, and we thought that today we would talk a bit about IR theory, in particular, how we both came to IR theory, and then the different ways which we've, I guess, come about theorizing the international differently, the ways in which we might think about international relations theory that challenge some of the ways in which we came to it, or in my case, kind of the reverse. So I think I will maybe kick off because my story here may be a little bit bizarre, but Kavi's story.
I think it's definitely the interesting story. Yeah.
Yeah, interesting story. So my introduction to international relations, in a way, didn't really come from IR. I really started with history, and I was interested in history largely because of Jewish history and the Holocaust. And so most of my early introductions to international relations weren't in political science, but were in history. And when I started studying international relations theory specifically, which was at the University of Victoria, the stuff that I was studying was not the normal, canon of IR theory. It was post-structuralist literature, or post-structuralist inspired literature, and a lot of the ways in which I explored international relations didn't really have anything to do with anarchy or international systems or international society or any of the core concepts that we teach in our IR theory courses now. It was very kind of post-colonial. It was identifying the ways in which borders don't really exist in the way we think they exist. So things were like ranges. I remember one lecture where somehow the professor was talking about whales. I don't even know what that was about. I still can't remember. And all I got is a note about whales. I think it's like a question mark beside it. Different ways of theorizing spaces, right? As thin lines, as big lines, as like zigzag lines, as broken lines. It was just a very different way of thinking about international relations, and it sort of emphasized the centrality of people and, I guess, places and spaces as opposed to sovereignty and related juridical borders. The whole Holocaust background came into this as well because of Bauman's book Modernity and the Holocaust, which was one of my early readings in political science, and gave just a whole other sort of spin on how we think about modernity and the ways in which the modern state is built around certain structures of inherent violence and exclusion. And then when I went to grad school, I discovered, wait a minute, international relations theory has these things called anarchy, and there's an international system, and what the hell is that? And all this, there's society, and that's when I started getting into kind of the canon of the literature. So my introduction to international relations was kind of backwards. It is not starting with the canon, kind of IR 101, Westphalia and those types of concepts, which will be familiar to international relations students. It was from a completely different direction. What about you, Kavi? How were you introduced to IR theory?
That's interesting because, I have I guess the much more traditional route, especially for North American, right, IR program. So I also I did my undergrad in Canada, like you, but in McGill. And McGill, particularly at that time, but it's a very large department. The IR classes were your fundamental sort of realism, liberalism, constructivism, some Marxism. I think I got, but that was the basic sort of paradigm that they were working with. Is that these are the fundamentals of international relations that have been taught since the beginning of time, and we're going to be debating realism versus liberalism, and to what extent those theories can help us understand our world today, that world being a post 9/11 world. So this I started my undergrad just a few years after 9/11. So of course, some of the biggest challenges to realism, liberalism at that time was that sort of focus on the state and how, we see suddenly non-state actors, well, suddenly, in quotations here, suddenly non-state actors are seemingly really important. So I had a very kind of traditional North American introduction to international relations. And in some ways, I wasn't necessarily resistant to that, not really knowing what IR as a field was. And in fact, one of my earliest sort of seminar debates I had in undergrad was defending realism by myself against against a slew of others that found it, unethical, an unethical kind of position to be in. I was assigned that position, by the way, to defend. I didn't choose it, but nonetheless, it was. I found it really interesting to try and adopt this position that I didn't necessarily believe in and talk about it. So that all said, I went through undergrad and had a very traditional sort of March of the Paradigms kind of education into IR. It was only towards the end of my program that I started on my own, and well, I shouldn't say on my own, partly influenced by my mom, who does work on post-colonial theory. I started reading just more on my own about post-colonial theory and post-structuralism, and my capstone sort of project was about a post-colonial approach to nuclear weapons, right? A very traditionally realist security studies kind of area. And that sort of got me into sort of more of this kind of critical literature that I found much more interesting and have been much more influential for the work that I do now. And so after McGill, I did my master's at the New School, where these sorts of themes, right, are really taken up much more deeply. Far more interest in post-structuralism, post-colonial theory, and now new materialism or post-humanism, right? Really cutting-edge stuff of political theory that's kind of coming into international relations, and then that was amplified even further at Hopkins, where that department as well, right, is very much engaged with how some of the tools of political theory that are not sort of necessarily grounded in early Enlightenment philosophical thought, how some other types of political concepts and tools can be important for IR. So I guess mine was a much more traditional way of kind of broadening out from the quote unquote mainstream of the discipline to something that was more critical or plural.
Your story reminds me of this experience I had still as an undergrad. There was a conference. It's a student conference. I can't remember if it was specifically international relations, but I think it was some sort of IR theory or global politics, something or other conference. And it was at UBC in Vancouver. And it was all undergrads. So there's some of us from UVic, obviously from UBC. They had professors from a few different institutions, including, I think there was a branch, it's bigger now, but at the time there was a UBC branch in Kelowna. So there were some people from some of the colleges around the province as well, but it was basically just UVic and UBC and probably some people from SFU, I don't remember exactly. Except what was really obvious was the massive difference in how those of us who came from UVic and pretty much everyone else was thinking about international relations. So one of the questions that we had under discussion was, does Russia still matter? And this was because of the post-Cold War. So now that the Soviet Union no longer exists, and you don't have that Cold War rivalry, there's this big question ostensibly around whether or not Russia still matters in the same way. And the argument that was advanced by pretty much everybody from UBC and wherever else was, yes, they matter because they have nuclear weapons. And those of us from UVic were like, well, this is stupid. It's like, they don't matter because they've got nuclear weapons, or, they matter because there's a lot of people there. right? Think of the landmass. Think of, and the clear cutting going on in Siberia. Think the environmental issues there. Think about the effects of Chernobyl. All of these other issues which sort of helped us to understand why Russia and the space and the people might matter was what we were thinking about, as opposed to kind of the guns and bombs crowd of everybody else. And the segue here, so you're talking about 9/11. So I was in Israel on 9/11, and I was visiting family, and it was this really weird experience for me, because I was asleep at my aunt's place, and her apartment is in Hadera. It's like a sort of a coastal town, a bit north of Tel Aviv. It's not directly on the sea, but it's really close. And I started hearing these sonic booms, which by itself was not that unusual, but there was quite a few of them, one after another, and sort of the sequence of them and the regularity, this number of them, was a bit unusual. So I kind of get up, I look out the window, is anything going on? Can I see like smoke on the horizon or something really ominous like that? And it's nothing. End up turning on the news, on CNN, and I see, these towers, and obviously there's, like many other people who think it's a movie, right? There's this weird disconnect. Anyways, fly back a few days later, the flight is empty. Everybody in Israel was talking about how now, everybody knows what it's like for us living under terrorism. And that was sort of the initial narrative, which I was hearing. It wasn't the one that you're describing. It was really about, we warned you, because in fact, there had been some discussions with Israeli security, consultants, specifically in regard to Logan Airport. And so I've been told. And then, and this constant narrative, okay, now you know what it's like, right? So the idea of having to deal with non-state actors as a massive security threat wasn't new to them, and it wasn't new to me either, with the sort of with my family in Israel. And then when I got back to UVic, what really shocked me, for better or for worse, was the extent to which students there were traumatized by this. Like, there were people crying in classrooms. They had classroom settings. Classes were set up specifically to discuss what had happened. And I was just, what really kind of shook me was the extent to which what had happened was impacting, I didn't know these people, the various students in my classes, large classes, but how much it was impacting them on the west coast of Canada, on Vancouver Island, far removed from anything. Like, I doubt most of these people actually had any connection to New York or the specific events of that day. But nevertheless, it was so big for them. And that really stayed with me. And I think it also, probably without even being aware of it, really helped shape my own ways of thinking about international relations by focusing on how people experience it. And, and that's not, the state. That's not the realist questions, but all of a sudden we got to think about non-state actors, right? It's, that's always been there. And there's this whole other side, right, of how people experience international relations, which we don't really study, right? Maybe sociologists or anthropologists might, but they probably wouldn't, because they'd be dealing with the international dimension. So,
right, exactly. I mean, I think that's also the, if we were to chart something that connects all these different lines of different forms of critical theories of international politics, or other types of approaches that are doing something that's not just focused on the structuring effects of anarchy on states, or the possibilities of international institutions to mitigate anarchy or to permit some forms of cooperation or reduce transaction costs, right? Any of that sort of classic kind of literature within IR. I think these critical approaches are trying to understand, right, that where does politics actually happen? How do people experience politics, right? And we're not getting that sense of international, we're not going to be able to arrive at that sense of international politics by simply looking at, how states are sort of reacting to, changes in the distribution of power, changes in the amount of military weapons or new technology or something like that, right? It's how people are feeling about politics, right? These emotional attachments or disruptions to particular events. It's how people are talking about it and constituting what's what's important or defining problems in a particular way, right? um, I remember just on this sort of issue of non-state actors, right? They're sort of key scholars within neorealism, for instance, that to this day, when we talk about if you talk about ISIS or you talk about other terrorist groups, right? It's fundamentally that, well, really, if we want to understand international politics, these actors are not significant to how politics works. The only thing that is really significant, or the only thing that we really need to try to understand and explain, right, are the outbreak of great power war, right? Or in other words, the areas in which realism has kind of dominated. But of course, taking that kind of approach just neglects or sidelines so much of how international, transnational, or global politics actually works, right?
I mean, for me, I've always felt that most of the mainstream IR theories are really variations of the world according to the United States, which in some ways isn't that surprising because so many of these theories came out of the United States, or at least I should say a lot of the research has come out of the United States. When I first studied international theory in grad school, it was at the LSE, and the reading list was the one devised by Fred Halliday, the late Fred Halliday. And Fred had this concern, I guess, and it's apparent in quite a few of his works about what it is that international relations as a specific area of studies offers, that there's something unique about the international order, and IR theory as such is the academic I guess contribution to trying to make sense out of that. And he's written in one of his pieces how international relations is more than just news commentary. And I kind of feel that actually for a lot of students, actually IR really is just a form of news commentary, and trying to kind of move beyond it can be really challenging. And I'm curious about whether or not Fred was actually I don't know, was Fred right? Is there something specific about the international order that IR theory has something to say about, or is there the opposite might be say the Graham Allison foreign policy view, which is IR theory is nonsense. It's really just about decision making and in the halls of foreign policy institutes. And I'm kind of the view that actually Allison is probably right, but Fred was also, except he was focusing in the wrong place. It wasn't the international order, the as such, that was the interesting question. It's more about the ways in which, as you're saying, people experience it. And even though he didn't, explicitly write, on that vein, his work on revolutions, I think, kind of pushes a bit in that direction, where you start to look at different places where the international happens, where the international is experienced. It does produce a problem for the likes of us, though, because we've got to design these courses, right? We have to introduce, IR theory, and then figuring out, okay, what should we be introducing? And then I guess getting to the second part, perhaps, of our discussion today, once we've decided what the mainstream is, which is pretty obvious, the march of the isms, the march of the theories, then what does it mean to think about the international differently, and how compelling are these different ways of theorizing the international?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny too, because when I also, when I'm talking to students about their dissertation projects or things they want to engage with, right, on a deeper level over a longer term, it's also, I guess, much more in terms of that Allison view, right? That they're looking at particular political events or decisions, right, that are being taken up, and trying to understand the mechanics of how that decision was arrived at or possibly why that decision was arrived at, rather than maybe these broader synoptic kind of views. But I guess, transitioning to this other side of the discussion about, how we teach or how we design our IR theory classes, at different levels, at the undergraduate level, at the postgraduate level. I mean, we've been, for this class, right, try to disrupt a little bit of that simple march of the isms, that we start by discussing the problem of race and Eurocentrism in the constitution of the discipline. There's forays first into post-colonial theory and understanding how discourse and language and ideas, knowledge are constitutive of international politics, that they're deep ways in which imperialism has been enabled, right, or has been sort of made possible. But then, I'm still sort of drawn back, right, into, well, they need to know XYZ's perspective on power. They need to understand a little bit of the literature on norms, right? And you get kind of pulled back into teaching elements of the canon, because it feels like there needs to be some sort of touchstone or basis by which these students will be engaging with other scholars, perhaps, or other colleagues who are interested in international politics, that are familiar with these ideas. I think this came out in one of the classes that we were on about teaching gender in international politics, right? So even the critical approaches, right, when we're teaching feminist theories of IR, right, the readings, the canonical readings now are 20, 30 years old, right? And some pieces like the Tickner piece, which is interesting to look at, and a huge intervention in the discipline, right? It's responding to Morgenthau, right? That's now 80 years back in the discipline, and some of these concerns, I think that was even raised by one of our students about, well, how are we talking about gender? And it seems that we're just talking about and Lowe's question about where are the women, but what about non-binary folks, right? What about these new forms of gender identification? How does that impacting international politics? All that's kind of being left out, even they're sort of trying to do something, I guess, a little bit more critical or different. You kind of get pulled back into you get disciplined in a certain way.
Yeah, I feel that, it's the same, right? For me, I feel that there are these certain texts, particularly the graduate level, that we should be introducing students to. And it does feel that it's really hard, not to end up having to engage in some ways with these, with Morgenthau or with, Waltz, Bull, Carr, the usual suspects. And then, the literature you're saying that that we're introducing as, ways to think differently, inevitably are critiquing this earlier work. Sometimes I wonder, what, when students come to study international relations, what actually are they there to learn? What is it that they are, I guess, expecting? And, what are the types of questions, they're hoping they'll be able to answer? And, without, there's the problem of not knowing what's going on in anybody else's head. So for me, at least, when I started getting into international relations, it was built around this question of genocide and political orders that somehow sustain this, permit it, allow it, enable it, are complicit in it. And but then when I'm speaking about international relations, with friends, it's usually foreign policy stuff that they're interested in, right? I want to talk about Russia and Ukraine. What's going on there? Can we trust China? These kind of questions, right? And I have a feeling that for most students, it's probably those types of questions. And actually, as much as I hate to say it, some of the core ideas that we find within, I would say probably within realism more so for me, do make sense, but they don't get you very far. And that's to me where international, where thinking differently starts to really matter. So, if you're going to ask, okay, do we trust a country? To me, that's a very difficult question to answer, because I don't think most of the IR theory literature, certainly the classic stuff, can do that. And I'm left with, sort of a conundrum. Well, how do I determine what constitutes trust in that context? Who are the actors here? What are the norms or the values? Why would I assume that necessarily the kind of things that I might be expecting as evidence, right, of whether I should trust another country or another regime, is the right type of evidence for that? So I don't really have good answers to those kind of questions. I mean, for me, texts like and those bananas, beaches, and bases, where she asks, where are the women? The interesting, I mean, that was a really sort of foundational text for me when I was studying international relations as an undergraduate. But the point there is, like, I think for me, was this question of who are we counting, right? Who is missing from these stories, and what happens if we bring these other peoples, these other experiences into our account of international relations? And at that point, the questions totally change. It's not, the issues about, geopolitical strategy and rivalry between, countries, whether it's, or multiples of countries, EU, Canada, the United States, China, Russia, Korea, North, South Korea, all these kind of questions. To me, that's sort of like one area. And actually, if you have a few tools from some of the major theories, your history, and you know what's going on, you can probably come up with some pretty intelligent explanations and assessments of what's going on. But then you're missing so much more that I think we don't even know how to ask. That literature doesn't even tell us how to ask. We don't know who we're counting. And that's, to me, is the interesting question. Like, who are we counting and why?
Right. Yeah. And I think you're right. Right. I mean, if I'm also just judging by how people outside of our specific field, like how people ask about what I'm doing, or ask questions about politics, right? It could range from what's going on with Russia to Ukraine to what did Biden do at X particular moment, or just any kind of thing that is roughly around what's happening in the news, right? And I think there is a sense maybe in which certainly people are looking for deeper tools, right? They're looking for other kind of analytical tools or concepts to try to understand those types of problems, which seem to be, well, these are the problems that are often presented around us as constituting international politics and constituting foreign policy, right? And something that we need to be concerned about, which is certainly true. And I guess the question then is, to what extent, I guess pedagogically, right, what we need to be doing is not only then focused on giving tools to understand the world, but actually helping ourselves and students, right, understand different types of problems, right, or arrive at different types of problems and ask different types of questions, which also become really difficult when it comes the time for the dissertation, right, where you're trying to kind of structure, or a large sort of essay or paper where you're trying to structure a question that's not in the sort of traditional social science vein of a puzzle, right? Why or how something kind of happened.
Yeah, for sure. There's this, I've had this sort of recurring experience teaching international relations theory, where no matter how kind of off-piste I try to go, the students always gravitate back to the main texts. And I guess maybe a point to end on is, if we do try, I guess as teachers, to encourage our students to think about international relations differently, to imagine the international order differently, to maybe to focus to I don't know, look at Western, or the Western world, but I don't know, from a colonial perspective, right, or one which focuses, you mentioned race, say focuses on that, and they keep going back. Is that a failing of ours, is it that we're not making the case strong enough? We're not being able to articulate a persuasive account of why we should be, imagining or theorizing, explaining, understanding the global order, the international differently? Or is it that there is something just really seductive about these parsimonious theories that students really seem to gravitate to? Or last one, is this something about, where we teach, in the world, right? And the kind of Western centric, atmosphere in which, our students, live and experience the world.
Yeah, I mean, I think, that's tough to answer definitively, but I think my sense is that the parsimony of some of these theories, right, are and the simplicity in which they're able to grasp, different elements of how it seems states are acting or states are behaving in the world, I think is really attractive, right? In the sense that it provides a nice, clean, clear picture of a world that is roughly stable or roughly to be expected, right? We know that a rising China is going to produce tensions with the status quo power, right? We kind of very easily accept that people make rational decisions. People make some sort of cost benefit analysis. So why wouldn't states behave in sort of the same way? So I think there might be some of that which can kind of pull everybody, pull students, pull others towards those positions. But I also feel that perhaps some things are changing, at least in my very limited experience, right? And part of that change, I see with students that, for instance, in some of my undergraduate classes, right, they're regularly writing on pretty difficult and tough concepts like poststructuralism, or they're talking about discourse or Eurocentrism, rather than realism or liberalism or something per se, right? Some are writing on new materialism in a really effective and interesting way. And I think maybe some of that is that, giving up a little bit of that canon and introducing more people to some of the work that is now out there in top journals, right? About how to ask different types of questions, how to construct our arguments in different ways, and use some of the theoretical or conceptual resources that may be unfamiliar, may at times be unintuitive, but can be really provocative and interesting, right?
Yeah, I think that's probably a good place maybe to end. I've really enjoyed this, this conversation. I don't, usually these sort of conversations happen in my in my head. Am I allowed to say that? Right? I just feel this in my head as I'm, devising, the core structure. And yeah, I've definitely, I have noticed that, certainly my undergraduate students over the years, that there is, this increasing, I guess, diversity of questions that they're asking, which speak to, the wider range of literatures. I think it probably has something to do with the different program structure more than anything else. But I guess, I guess I'm always left wondering, whether or not if the students who are studying IR theory at the end of the day feel that, the theories are actually really helping to make sense of the world, or perhaps if they're just highlighting, the amount that we don't know. And, that's I guess for me, that's the point I want to end on. When I started my grad training, what appeared really quickly, what became really, really apparent was just how little I knew about anything and everything. And I sort of feel, maybe if we're able to teach that at least, our own ignorance, maybe we're doing something right. And the interesting and different questions, that I guess some of the literature is raising might become, I guess, more central in our imagination.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. Thanks so much, Kavi.
Thanks, Ilan.